This is a certificate that I got from Zechariah, and it was given to me after going to about 5 weekend-long seminars where Zechariah was the only presenter. And he had the idea at the beginning of this century, and I was lucky enough to be his assistant and help coordinate these seminars, to give people who wanted to do their own lectures enough material and information and a good basis in his books to do their own presentations, and to not just resuscitate or memorize stuff, but actually know what they're talking about and cover the basics, and I'll actually have a springboard or a base for expanding their own research and then eventually adding to the material and including stuff that they would figure out on their own. With Zechariah, I've been lucky enough to go to 4 countries with him. I traveled with him to England, Malta, Mexico, and Italy. I've been his seminar coordinator for the last, for now 9 years, his webmaster, and I'm very happy to call him a good friend. Well, this is our planet. This is everybody from history that we've ever known. This is a picture from the Apollo 8 NASA mission, several missions before the moon landing. But this was the first time that Earth was photographed over another astronomical object, the moon, which you can see is extremely desolate and barren. Nothing there, no vegetation, no landmarks, nothing significant to mark where you are. And this little jewel blue planet full of water and over 200 million species of life that are found in every possible area of our planet. Down, well, obviously on the surface where we live, in the deserts where it's dry, forests, jungles, at the deepest parts of the ocean where there's no sunlight at all, just vents that put out sulfur and gas and other noxious chemicals. Life thrives everywhere on this planet. Our planet is less than 1/1000th the mass of this solar system, yet we find in such an enormous body of life here. It just means that the conditions for life are so wonderful, and life will thrive when it can. Every year, thousands of new species are found and cataloged from adventures under the water and from places that were never explored before. And there's still parts of the Earth that have not been explored by scientists, and there's still every year just finding new species all the time. This is a picture from the Hubble Deep Field. Hubble is a space telescope. When they first put Hubble up, it had an optical problem, but that problem was fixed. In this one picture, you're seeing 4,000 galaxies. Every dot of light here is a completed galaxy. These are not stars. And this is also as far back as the age of the universe that they can determine. We're talking 13, 14, 15 billion years ago. And what did they see? Completed galaxies. So our galaxy, the Milky Way, is about 100,000 light years across. And we have about 300 billion or more stars in our galaxy alone. The one we know that has life is Earth. That's our single data point. But astronomers are constantly looking for other planets out there. So they question and they try to do calculations. Well, we know that there's other planets out there. How many potential Earth-type planets could possibly exist that could possibly have life on it? Back in 2002, when astronomers found the 100th exoplanet, that means the 100th planet outside of this solar system that orbits another star, they actually came to the conclusion that there's 30 billion Earth-type planets in our galaxy alone. But guess what? Now the count of exoplanets is over 300. So now the number estimated of Earth-type planets has passed 40 billion. So I wonder and I question, so why is it so hard to believe that life exists outside of this planet? Well, obviously, the majority of these people in this audience do believe in either UFOs or kind of alien visitation, but scientists don't have the concrete evidence for that. And the question is the fact that we are here evidence that other civilized beings or other civilizations exist that are intelligent, that could visit us? No. The problem is that it's in the evidence. And the question of evidence is where the problem lies between the believer, the eyewitness, the scientist who wants to prove it and have evidence to support his theory or his belief. Okay, on the left is Zachariah Sitchin. On the right is Monsignor Balducci from the Vatican. Unfortunately, Monsignor Balducci has recently passed away. Let me just a word about Monsignor. We met him in Italy at a conference that both Zachariah and the Monsignor spoke at, and then afterwards we had a lunch together, and they talked about things. The Monsignor was very impressed with Zachariah's presentation, which was based on physical evidence and real artifacts. But the Monsignor was at the conference to discuss UFOs, and also to discuss the fact that people who see UFOs, there's nothing wrong with that. There was a big stigma in Christianity that UFOs could be alien devils or being, demons or this type of negative connotation. And the church was afraid of something very significant. If you discount witness testimony from your neighbor from a week ago or a month ago, what do you think will happen to witness testimony of a religious nature from 2,000 years ago? Their fabric of their existence, their religion is tied to witness testimony. And we'll see in a moment what type of witness testimony. So the Monsignor was there to tell the audience that there's nothing wrong with witnessing a UFO. There should be no connotations against it. Nobody should think negative. And actually, you should believe your neighbor and not discount what they said. Now, about Zachariah. Zachariah was born in Lithuania, which was part of the old Soviet Union. He moved to Palestine when he was young. Eventually moved to London, where he worked for 30 years as an editor, and also worked on his first book, The 12th Planet, which was published in 1976. To date, Zachariah has over 13 books that have been published in over 24 languages, and he's sold, as far as we can tell, over 24 million copies of his books. The 12th Planet is usually a bestseller in every new market that it enters. And for those of you who are not familiar with Zachariah's theory or concept, it's very simple. When we look at ancient tablets and ancient stories, especially the Sumerian and other Mesopotamian culture remained tablets and stories, what we see is not just God stories and not just things that we're familiar with, but advanced knowledge, other information. And the question is, where did that information come from? How could they have known that? We're going to see some stuff that could be controversial, could be earth-shattering, could be mind-blowing for people who are not experienced or used to seeing this kind of stuff in such an old culture. We will see stuff that does not fit the paradigm of what we've been taught and the order of events that have occurred on Earth, thinking that we are the most advanced civilization ever to live on this planet. There is definitely evidence that indicates a different direction and a different order of events possibly occurred. So Zachariah, when he looked at this material and he found this advanced information, he basically said, well, I'm not going to discount what these ancient people left behind. I'm going to listen and hear and look at it and see if they're telling the truth and then try to validate it. So if we accept what some of the ancients left behind in their history, we will be open to a whole new concept and idea. And we actually don't have the right to say, oh, well, they're just making it up. It's just mythology. That's just a way of a defense mechanism, in a way of trying to protect ourselves. If we just are open to what they're leaving behind, it may open up our minds to what more possibilities are out there as well. This is a slide that's called Types of Data. The main type of data that I like to look at, and what Zachariah likes to look at, is called Class 1 data. And Class 1 data is consistent and verifiable by others, and it's predictable. That's scientific data. There is something to study. You can see it, and you may touch it. Example, carvings, depictions, recordings, and texts. And also in this lecture, I will be presenting what's called Class 1 data once removed. So it's research that I've found on my own. I photographed it from a book, I read the material, or in a museum, or in a library, and I'm now presenting it to you. So it's still Class 1 data because I personally have touched it or seen it. Now, if something's in a museum but it's behind a glass, it was still touched by the archaeologist and the person who dug it up. So that's still scientific. You don't have to physically touch it yourself. Class 2 data is several witness testimony, but there's nothing left behind. So this, the example I have here is people see a shooting star, but there's no evidence of it to physically test. That's a good example of Class 2 data. What would not be a good example, for example, is a car accident. Several people could see a car accident, but the accident will leave behind markings and scrapes and impact and metal and bent and paint all over the place, and that would be class 1 data. So class 2 data has to have nothing left behind. Class 3 data is even more weaker. Class 3 data is from personal experience only, single witness testimony, no outside verification, it's dependent on memory, emotional state, and agenda. The example I give here is a person sees a shooting star by themselves. Guess where the majority of data regarding UFO sightings, abduction cases is found? Class 3. Guess where the majority of religious stories are found, and history is class 3. One person wrote it down, or a few people wrote it down. There's no evidence for it. It's just their memory of the event. Now, what I like to do regarding UFOs and studying that specific subject is I like to look into the history, because there is something left behind that we can look at. I don't study UFO cases where there is no evidence, because it's only class 3 data, and for me, it's not a waste of time, but that knowledge is for that person who gained it. Their life could be changed by it, but it's their personal experience. So I'm only interested personally in stuff that has class 1 data. This is a timeline of the history of this planet from the museum in Malta when I was with Zechariah. What I like about it is that it starts from 3600 BC, which means it predates the history of the pyramids, it predates the history of Sumeria, or starts at the beginning. And here they have the Gigantea temples. Now they have stone temples on Malta, 23 of them, they're above ground, and they also have evidence of some of them washed over by water. And those that they believe were washed over by water is the flood that comes from the story of Noah in the Bible. So they believe that they have evidence of that great flood and that disaster. 2500, you have here the estimated date of the Great Pyramid. That's a point of argument. Stonehenge, 2000 BC. Now, from 2000 BC to 3600 BC, that's the area of a lot of the stuff that we're going to look at. The Sumerian, Akkadian tablets, old Mesopotamian stuff is that old. The time of Abraham, 2025 BC. The time of Jesus, right here, the 0 line. The time of us right here, 2000 AD. So we're going back to 2,000 years before Abraham, and 1,000 years before Abraham, which is 2,000 years before Jesus. Moses is allegedly around 1200 BC, 1250. The times of the kings of Israel is between 1000 BC and 500 BC. So we're going back 2,000 years to Jesus, another 2,000 years to Abraham, and even prior to that to look at information that's left behind in the archaeological record. This is literally a library shelf in a museum of clay tablets. This is the kind of evidence that we look at. Now, why is this significant? Well, guess what? This is the original. This is what the scribe wrote. This isn't on parchment. This isn't something like my notes that won't exist in 1,000 years. So when we think of the old cultures as primitive, what's interesting is that the way they recorded their information left us with the possibility of that data sustaining and surviving. As long as this is not blown up, the walls aren't crushed, it's not broken into pieces, this will exist for literally forever. So this is the original. We are looking at the original tablets, the original stories. We don't have to wonder what the scribe wrote. It is there. This happens to be from a museum in Turkey. And we hope that all of these have been translated. But this is almost like the way they found libraries when they dug up the king's libraries in the old days. Ashurbanipal, for example, they found this library. And at the front of the shelf was a tablet that listed an index of everything on the shelf. So they would then look for the things on the shelf, and the archaeologists would discover, okay, we have one story missing or tablet missing, or we have everything. It was kept in a very orderly manner because the king, as having an empire, needed to keep order and organization. The thing about this civilization we're talking about is that organization and records is what makes the information so significant. And also, we know how old something is because of the type of writing that it used. Now, this is the first form of writing that's found on Earth that is a big body of data for. Now, when I say big body of data, This type of writing, all of these forms, we're talking about 1 million tablets. Slightly less than 1 million, slightly more, depending on the estimate that you use. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about data, a lot of it. Not just one piece like linear A or B where there's only 1 or 2 examples, or Indus Valley script where there's no complete literary works. We're talking about complete tablets, multiple versions of the same story, and they're easily datable by the language that they're in. The first language in the pictographic writing was Sumerian pictograph. Now notice the first one here is Earth, Ki. And Earth is not round. Right here, Earth is actually an egg shape, which is very similar to how Earth actually looks. It is not a perfect circle. And yet, the Greeks always believed in the form of the perfect circle, and so did the Egyptians. And there was a lot of philosophy behind church religion and the perfect circle, and God created perfect circle forms. And that's why they believe the planets orbited in perfect circles for thousands of years. Yet, in the first form of writing, they don't even have a perfect circle in there. This is the term for mountain. So you see how the cuneiform was, the pictographic writing was this way, then it turned this way, and then eventually it became cuneiform script. And in this case, Assyrian is the last one that we're showing on this. This is from one of Zechariah's books, The 12th Planet. Now look here. This word mountain is kur in Sumerian. In Hebrew, the word for mountain is har. So kur becomes har. Very typical after thousands of years of spoken languages, small deviations occur from accents, from culture to culture. The word for man is Lu. Well, guess what? Lu is still a man's name. And the word Lulu, which means mixed up, was also a term that the Sumerians created first. They called us, human beings, Lulu Amelu, means a mixed up being because of the way that they thought about the way we were created from a mixed up batch of clay and other things, and we'll talk about that later. So they came up with that first. That was certain terms that they left behind that we still use today. And you will see a whole bunch of these type of first occurrences that are found in the archaeological record in the Sumerian tablets. This is a history of writing on this planet. This is from the book, The Story of Writing by Andrew Robinson. The first type of complete form of writing is Sumerio-Akkadian cuneiform. Now, Akkadian was the first Semitic language. When Sumerian turned into Akkadian, they find dictionary tablets where literally it says this word in Akkadian is this word in Sumerian. After that, we have Egyptian hieroglyphics. Other things come out, Proto-Sinaitic, Canaanite. Here's early Phoenician. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is Old Hebrew writing is using Phoenician letters. The sounds of the letters, like Aleph, Bet, Gimel, is Phoenician. The style of Old Hebrew letters was also Phoenician, and the sounds. Okay? Later on, Aramaic becomes the language of spoken, like the time of Jesus, they spoke Aramaic, and those letters of the Aramaic script become the basis of the modern Jewish writing. Also, what you see is here that there's multiple influences coming into all languages, especially Hebrew here. Now here it shows that Old Hebrew basically runs out because the character set that Old Hebrew uses, which was Phoenician, is extinguished and it's replaced, but not the language. What happens is that you don't need to have written text for language and for stories to continue. Those are passed down orally. What's also interesting is anybody's language could be written in anybody's character set. You can write Sumerian with English letters. You can write English with Sumerian letters. Everybody's character set has every sound that we make. In English, we have 26 letters, and it covers all the sounds of the mouth, except there's a few, for example, that in Hebrew, you have to have combination letters, like a cha in Hebrew is spelled with a ch, like Chanukah. So they find ways to make that sound with English letters. So anybody's language on Earth could be written with anybody's character set. And that's part of how we go back and we see how old something is based on what letters, what language, and what style of writing it is. And therefore we know what came first and what came after. Okay, this is actually what the Sumerians look like. Now, none of these are gods here. This guy down here is called Gudea. He was the last Sumerian king. The Sumerian culture lasted from pre-4000 BC to 2000 BC with interruptions by Akkadian Empire, for example, Sargon the Great, king of Akkadia. But what happened was they when empires conquered each other back then, they didn't wipe out the previous culture's documents or stories. They actually copied them and incorporated them. It's very similar how to when the Roman Empire was around, Greek was still the favored language. As we will see when we get to the New Testament stuff, most of the originals was written in Greek. Just like hundreds of years ago, Latin was the language that the aristocracy and the upper class taught their children, because the last empire that existed, Rome, spoke in Latin. So it seems like every previous culture would respect the previous empire's language. So the Sumerian Empire and the Sumerian language as a spoken daily language, actually, it gets extinguished around the same time of Abraham in the historical record. Now, Abraham is told to leave his place in Ur, the capital city of Samaria, and go to Haran. And then we see in the archaeological record lamentation texts or stories of them complaining and crying over the destruction of their civilization. An evil wind came upon them, but it didn't destroy the buildings. It killed all the people, it killed all the animals, and the buildings survived. And we also find evidence of mass tombs, like in Ur, the royal tomb cemetery of Ur, and other mass deaths at that time, but the buildings survived. Okay, and this is the area where the Sumerians and later on Akkadians, Assyrians lived. Does it look familiar to anybody? We've had a lot of activity there recently, haven't we? Okay, this shows the modern cities that are existing in Iraq, Basra, and Baghdad right now, and some of the ancient settlements. Here's Ur. Here's Eridu. Eridu is actually the prototype of the word earth. The word earth comes from the city name Eridu later on, as it gets changed over thousands of years. Here's Uruk, where Gilgamesh will come from, and we'll see some of Gilgamesh. Okay, here's Babylon, the empire that becomes popular later and destroys the Judean kingdom. Up here we'll find Nineveh. Here's Nimrod, a famous king, Ashur for Assyria. You know, all this area here is where most of the tablets came from, the cradle of civilization. The area between the Euphrates and the Tigris River, where civilization was able to develop and where all this record keeping was done. Okay, this is from the book by Samuel Noah Kramer, called History Begins at Sumer. These are some of the things we find in these tablets, what's written, what's found in them. The first case of schools, the first case of governments, in this case bicameral Congress. That's the kind of Congress we have. That's a double-body Congress that argues. The first case of law codes, social reform, justice, medicine, agriculture, horticulture, philosophy, ethics. The first proverbs, funny sayings, for example, man for his pleasure marriage, on thinking it over, divorce, is a proverb from the Sumerians. Also, it'd have to come to me. There's a good one about a rich man who can never sleep at night, but a poor man can. There's just total volumes and volumes full of proverbs that the Sumerians left behind. So what we're seeing is that the oldest influences, also the first cosmogony and cosmology, that means the first discussions of how our solar system came to be, how human beings came to be created, is also found there. The first biblical stories, the first Noah flood stories, the first tales of resurrection, the first man's heroic age, the first list of catalogs, the first messiahs. Now, the Messiah of the old days was a hero king who would come and save your civilization from an evil empire or an evil control by a foreign power. All of these things are found in these tablets that I've just shown you. And all of these are found and eventually creep into our civilization and occur and show up in many different areas. Another thing, this kind of knowledge, the Sumerians themselves, the king did not take credit for it themselves. Normally in the old days, a king would make famous I scored a victory in this battle, or I created an aqueduct, or I did this for the people. What's unique over here is that all this knowledge they attribute to their gods. Now, Steve mentioned that they called their gods the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki means Anu is from heaven, Na they came, and Ki is that word earth. So from heaven they came to earth. Those who from heaven to earth came. That's what they called their gods. And they gave tribute to these gods for all this knowledge that they got. They did not claim it was for themselves or came from themselves. Okay, this is the way the mathematical system of the Sumerians shown here. This is also from Zechariah's book. Now notice, this is what we claim that we use. We claim we use a decimal system. You know, 10 fingers, 10 toes, 10 times 10 is 100, and we count this way. But this is actually not true. The Sumerian system was called sexagesimal. They used sixes and tens. Okay, 6 times 10 times 6 times 10 times 6. But they also use multiples of 6. So how many months in the year? 12. That's 2 times 6. How many tribes of Israel? 12. How many disciples of Jesus? 12. 2 times 6. How many hours in a day? 24, which is 4 times 6. How many seconds in a minute? 60. 10 times 6. And minutes in an hour? 60. We still use their sexagesimal system today. And when you look at a textbook, they'll say, oh, the Babylonians is the Babylonian mathematical system that we use, but they actually inherited it from the Sumerians. They won't even give the Sumerians credit for it except for a sideline. All the textbooks will say Babylonian. But tell me, does anybody here know how to tell a baker that he wants, or you want, a group of 10 donuts or 10 bagels? Nobody? It's called a deca. Go ahead and tell your baker, hey, can you give me a deca of donuts? He'll be like, what? Deca? What are you talking about? I know dozen, I know baker's dozen. We're still using their system now for timekeeping, for the calendar, for degrees in a circle, 60 times 6, and for advanced mathematics. And there's a very special reason that they use this sexagesimal system. For example, the zodiac. Again, a Sumerian invention found in the record in the tablets. This is from when time began by Zechariah. This is all the names of the zodiac animals. They created the zodiac plus the animals, or at least it's found in the record first with them. They may not have created it because they actually claim that they learned it from their gods. Goanna is a heavenly bull. Mashtaba's twins. Absin, whose father was Sin, the maiden Virgo. Girtab, the claw, the cutter, Scorpio. But here's the funny thing about the zodiac. What the zodiac does is it charts precession. Now, precession of the equinoxes means that when the Earth spins, it wobbles. It's not a perfect circle. That wobbling has a cycle. That cycle used to be 25,920 years. It has slightly changed over the thousands of years. And that is why we have different zodiacal ages, because of that precession. It is the constellation that is behind the sun at the spring equinox. So, during the time of Taurus, for example, in Egypt, all of the artwork has bulls. During the time of Aries, all the artwork has rams. The time of Jesus, people don't really know why some people use the symbol of a fish for the sign of Jesus. That's because he came in at the time of Pisces, the Piscean age. Now we're entering the age of Aquarius, like the famous song from the show Hair. And so this is the next age that's coming. Every zodiacal age is 2,160 years. Times 12 of those cycles, you'll get 25,920. An astronomical number. For some reason, these people in 3000 BC, 2000 BC, knew about precession and labeled the animals. The question is how? Either we believe what they told us, or we simply ignore it, but the evidence exists. And this is type 1 data. We see it from the artwork and from what's left behind in the tablets. Also, here appears the way that they describe the heavenly spheres. The way of Anu was considered the top band of sun planets in the zodiac constellations. The way of Enlil, the northern skies. The way of Ea, the southern skies. Ea is also known as Enki. We will see these names mentioned later on as they become prominent in their stories. Okay, this is a copy that I made in the University of Pennsylvania's library. This is from mathematical tablets up here, mathematical, meteorological, and chronological tablets. The professor that translated these was called H.P. Hillcraft. And what you're seeing is the most incredible thing that I found in calculation of numbers for any ancient civilization. And I don't know if you could tell what this number is. This is 195 trillion. 955 billion, 200 million. That's the starting number. and they divide this number down, divide that number by 600,000, the answer will be 326 million something something. You divide this gigantic number down by 729, the answer will be 268,800,000. Why? Were they trying to figure out how big the America's national debt would be several thousand years in the future? I mean, I didn't even start thinking about trillions until our national debt passed $1 trillion. Then everyone started talking about trillions. This is from the Library of Nippur, a tremendous find of tablets when they found it. Here's Nippur mentioned here. And these are division tablets. Now, they don't show you the work. They just have the numbers. This number divided by this equals this. It's a mathematical table, a multiplication table, and a division table. But why 195 trillion? It doesn't make any sense for people living in 2,000 to 3,000 BC. I mean, you should just be caring about, you know, my ox hopefully will survive, and my cow, and, you know, I want to eat the grain, and hopefully I have food the next day. What's the point of using numbers so massive? It's beyond all logic to consider what they were for. But obviously, they had a purpose. I mean, maybe they were calculating distance to a star. But that means that they would know about other stars. What other purpose could there be for 195 trillion? And this is another special number they also used to divide, 12,960,000. That's still an astronomical and an absolutely large number for an ancient civilization to even think about. But at least this one is something that I can make sense of. This is 3,600 squared. So 3,600 would be 60 times 6 times 10, and you would get 3,600, right? Also, it's 43,000 zodiacal ages. But guess what you find right here? 12,960,000 divided by 500 is the exact amount of years in the precessional cycle. In the historical record, Hipparchus, one of the Greeks, is usually credited with not only discovering precession, but coming up to some kind of calculation for it. This is 2,000 to 3,000 years before Hipparchus. Here is the amount of years in the zodiacal ages recorded in tablet form that will never be destroyed, hopefully, and they got it first. How the heck could they have known this information? What would the purpose be for a civilization that existed so many thousands of years ago? 12,906,000 divided by 500, exact amount of years. So this number is 500 precessional cycles. And again, just like 195 trillion, this was the starting number. They took this number and broke it down. Here they broke it down by 125. Here they broke it down by 250, and here by 1,000. And they broke it down, 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 until it came down to the lowest common denominator. I mean, a most incredible, the question of why is too small. How could they have known it? How could they have been so precise? How could they have gotten a number that equally divides and gives you the exact numbers of years that our axis wobbles? And then to create a cycle of zodiac based on that number. It's an astounding piece of advanced knowledge. And of course, not just the mathematical knowledge, but the astronomical knowledge from a visual point of view. So what we just saw was mathematical. It's written down in textual form. Now we get a combination. Notice this is a cylinder seal. That means that this is a rolled object that will create this impression. First of all, you can see the ancient writing here. This is cuneiform script. Notice the Saturn has rings. Now, I've looked at thousands of seals. This is the only depiction that I could find that's this old that shows Saturn with rings. For Saturn to have rings, you have to have binoculars with at least a 10 or 12 power or a telescope. But in the Western world, it's the 1600s to 1700s where the credit of discovering the telescope is and binoculars. Here we have the Earth and the Moon, Venus, Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. Now it's not to scale, which is very common. They did not draw a lot of the planet sizes to scale. But notice, this is a straw. Now what's being depicted in this picture is the drinking of beer. This is a beer jug. This is a keg of the old days. And a very giant straw, because they like to be leisurely and sit down and drink it like this. And they actually found 250 recipes for beer, another Sumerian invention. But guess where the straw is? The straw is between Mars and Jupiter, which is where the asteroid belt is. which is interesting because the straw could be put anywhere. But where the straw actually is where the asteroid really is, the asteroid belt is. And I find that interesting because with this knowledge of Saturn with rings, it gives a more interesting reason to look at the straw placement for this. Again, how did they know? This is cylinder seal VA243. This is in a museum in Germany, formerly East Germany. It's a place called Pergamon Island where they have several museums. It's a 2500 BC Akkadian cylinder seal, and what it's being depicted is, here's the owner's name. A cylinder seal was like a stamp, and you could put it on wet clay, and therefore it would have your name on it, and you could send a letter to somebody. This is the god Enki. We know he's a god because he has a horned hat. And this guy has a horned helmet. Horned hats, horned helmets is a sign of a god. Also, Enki is seated down, but notice he's seated, but he's the same size as these other guys. If Enki stood up, he'd be very, very tall. And what's being depicted in the picture is the plow. Now notice the hand gesture right here. They're giving, the hand gesture is giving the plow to mankind. And in their stories and in their written text, and this is backed up, this is the visual record and in the textual record as well, they attribute the plow being given to them by Enki, the god, who said, hey, take this plow and let me show you how to cultivate and harvest and do things. But what is this up here? Well, first of all, it seems to look like a solar system. Does it look like a solar system to you? A lot of people believe that this is also a Star of David representation. It is a six-pointed star. Now remember, this is 5,000 years old, so there's a little bit of wear and tear on it. Let me show you how I identify the planets that are shown here. Earth and the Moon, Mercury and Venus, Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. Mars, we have an asteroid belt here. In a second I'll tell you what this is called. Jupiter and Saturn. Now remember I told you they don't make the size of the planets to scale, but these are still bigger and that's still smaller. This little object here is where we have the asteroid belt now. In their history, the gods said that they came from a planet called Nibiru. Nibiru was the planet of crossing. It came around an average orbital span of 3,600 years in their mythology, in their stories. So this to us looks like they're showing every astronomical object that they had a god representing. And what happens is, that's why the moon is shown and that's why the sun is shown. Because each one of their gods, their pantheon of 12, had an object that was represented by. And that's why 12 became, or 2 times 6 became one of these popular numbers, and of course was carried on later on by the months of the year, the tribes of Israel, disciples of Jesus. This number 12 is extremely significant. 12 Olympian gods as well. All of that stems from this. In other words, this represents each of their gods, each object in our solar system. So we know that we have 9 planets, plus the moon, plus the sun, that gives us 11, plus an extra planet, but we have the asteroid belt now. And the asteroid belt by itself is not big enough to be a planet, but it is the remnant of something that was smashed. And over billions of years, it's quite possible that the planet that they came from had disintegrated or smashed or at least created debris that got locked in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. Again, when I was in school, I was never taught that the ancients knew the sun was in the center. I was always taught that that was not figured out until Copernicus figured it out until the mid-1600s. This is 2500 BC, and the sun is shown in the center. And all the planets that we know of today are also shown, including Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. Pluto wasn't even discovered until the 1930s. Uranus and Neptune in the 1800s. This is way too advanced for a culture in that time frame of 2500 BC. The only way it could make sense, well, you have to ask yourself, how could it be? This exists. This is a piece of legitimate artifact that's in a museum on their permanent display. It's type 1 data. A person has to ask themselves, well, how did they know it? Did they get lucky? There was an astronomer that argued with Zechariah who says, no. They're not depicting our solar system, they're depicting another solar system. Well, that made no sense either, because then they would be knowing about another star system outside of our own. And then later on, that astronomer retracted his story and said, yes, 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 I was too hasty. Oh, maybe it could be Jupiter showing in the teapot. The teapot is a constellation that British astronomers created the name teapot because they used to drink tea at 3 or 4 o'clock every afternoon. But that wasn't an observation any ancient peoples made, and Jupiter never shows up in the teapot. So all alternative explanations for this picture have failed to prove anything other than it's our own solar system shown fairly accurately, even somewhat to size. The moon is small, Mercury is small, Pluto is small. Jupiter and Saturn are the biggest planets, so is Uranus and Neptune. Everything else is smaller. And this planet is shown about as big as Jupiter and Saturn. This little object here we call the toy rocket ship. This is an object that was sitting in a director's museum drawer, or in his office drawer in Turkey. And Zechariah found out about the object and he went to see the director of the museum, the curator. And he said, why isn't it on display? It was found 15 feet below the ground and dug up by their own archaeologists. He says, well, it's a rocket ship. Obviously, a spaceship didn't exist thousands of years ago, so we can't put it out because it's got to be a fake of some kind. We have something original. Nothing else is like this. How can our museum put out something? This is what was told to Zechariah. How can our museum put out something that nobody else has that's completely original? We all thought that's the point of museums, to put out especially rare objects, especially things that are so rare and unique that you have something special to come to see at the museum. Eventually what Zechariah did was Zechariah showed the museum curator other objects that looked like this, so that he was able to put it out on the shelves, but they put a little note on it that we think it's a fake. But at least it got out there. Now, as you could see, I only have one picture of it, but from different angles. This is the drawing of what it looked like before. It has a little bit of damage on it. It literally looks like it looks like a shuttlecraft, a shuttle pod with 3 booster engines in the back. Now, of course, found 15 feet below the ground level. It's very, very old. So that's a physical object. Now, so I asked myself, you know, when I was doing this research, okay, well, that's a physical object. What about in the pictographic writing behind? Did we also see these objects? And the answer is yes. This is the word dingir. Now, what you're looking at, you will have to decide for yourself what you think this is, okay? But let me tell you what dingir means. The word din is a Semitic word. It still exists today. In Hebrew, Beit Din is a house of justice or a house of judgment. That's a courthouse. The Arabs have the word mujahideen, holy warriors. So the word din means holy or righteous or justice. The word gir means flashy or fiery lightning. And I believe Zechariah was the first to come up with that definition for gir as well. So this object is called the righteous ones of the flashy, fiery object thing. You will see in a moment a slide that shows a clear progression. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first word ever in the history of writing that was mistranslated as the word God. To the Sumerians, this was not the word God. This meant those righteous ones that were in that fiery, flashy thing. But the next language down, Akkadian, mistranslated this and made it the word for God. So the first time God was used in writing, this is what the picture of it looked like. Now let me just show you the word gear. Here's from a book, Sumerian Language by Mary Louise Thompson. And here's the definition of the word gear. To lighten, to flash like lightning. This was released in 1984. Zechariah's book came out, the first one in 76. So Zechariah actually had the definition of this word, and it's the earliest I could find, which was now an established definition for the word gear. So this is flashy or holy, righteous people of the flashy, fiery object. And this is how it got translated down, or I should say mistranslated down through history. Dingirs first. Now there was 2 types of dingir in their tablets, and when you look at an old Sumerian tablet translated into Akkadian or Syrian, you see dingir, and then it brings the word Ilu, Ilani, or Eluti underneath it. That means lofty ones or gods. There was two types of Dingir. The Anunnaki were the ruling council, the level of, you know, the commanders. The regular staff, or the lower level, you know, non-commissioned officers, let's say, were called Igigi. Igigi means those who observe and see. And the Hebrew translated this as later on became the word watchers. And in Hebrew, Iri. So Igigi became the word Iri in many scrolls, and some of that we'll see later. But directly from the word Dingir became the word Ilu, Ilani, and Eluti. And then later on, that's in Hebrew terms, that changes that language. The sounds becomes El, Eloha, and Elohim. Now this is singular, singular, and plural. Now there's a big argument on the, you know, between me and another professor if Elohim is plural or singular. Because in any Bible in English, Elohim will be said God and not gods. Well, of course, the purpose of the Bible is to prove that there's only one God. But the word Elohim already has two singular forms of God in it, El and Eloha. And in Hebrew, the I-am ending, the suffix, is plural. So strictly reading it as Hebrew and understanding the way the language is, this is a plural word, Elohim. Then later on, we're going to see characters called B'nai Ha-Elohim, children of the gods. And they're going to intentionally mistranslate this word, and we'll see that soon too. So this means children of the gods, which are characters mentioned before the flood. And the reason for the flood being given, why there was a need for a flood to wipe out mankind and other so-called evil people. So from Dingir, the first time we see a word gets mistranslated right away as God. And the only way to go back and to see that is to literally go back language by language to see where the first source comes from. This is called the planisphere disk. It's in the British Museum. It's on permanent display. We're going to see, the next slide is going to be a sketch of this so that you'll be able to see the images on it a lot clearly. But here's what's interesting about this. First of all, we're not really sure what this is made out of because this is very smooth and this is smooth, and here it's melted. But it's not charred or black. So it's already interesting what it is. But you see, there's things like this here with arrows. There's this thing here. We're going to see clearly here. But what I want you to know is that this is what I consider one of the most important pieces of evidence on planet Earth itself. Okay, here's a sketch drawing of what we're looking at. First, we see here a shape that looks like an ellipse. An ellipse is not a circle. An ellipse has double foci. An ellipse is a shape that Kepler, the one who discovered the true planet's rotational shape, discovered in the 1700s, but here we have it depicted in the 2000 to 3000 BC area. Here we have a constellation that looks like Orion with an arrow pointing here. Here we have three intersecting lines and an arrow pointing here. And here we have this little thing and an arrow here, this little triangle thing. This part we're going to see the next slide is actually translated into English. But let me just clarify what we're looking here. If you travel in space, to depict how you travel in a three-dimensional grid on a two-dimensional surface, this is what you would have to do. You need 7 points of coordinates. You can have one as being where you are. Now, where I'm going, I need to connect 2 places and make a line. I need to connect 2 dots and make a line. I need to connect another 2 coordinates and make a line. You need 6 coordinates, and the intersecting point is going to be where you're going or where you came from. And that's what we see here. We see 3 intersecting lines, 1 coordinate system here, and double here, and double there, but we're missing some of this. This is literally showing how to travel 3-dimensionally on a 2-dimensional surface. And as a side note, the Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, when he was digging in Mexico, found an archaeological tablet that showed also 3-dimensional space travel on a 2-dimensional surface. He was on the radio with Zechariah talking about it one day. So there's another piece that exists that has the same type of information, but that one, as far as we know, is being held back by Mexican authorities. It hasn't been on display. At least this one's on display because it was discovered before any of this kind of knowledge was thought about, before there was rockets, before there was space travel, before anything could limit the release of it. And so it's been on the British Museum for like about 80 years now, or maybe 90. Okay? Now we're going to look at a close-up of this piece of the pie right here. Okay, this is from Zechariah's translation. This is Akkadian cuneiform, but they're speaking Sumerian. It took him 1 month just to translate this piece. First of all, here we have Kakab Anu, Kakab Anu. Okay, Kakab is an astronomical object. In Hebrew, the word star is Kochav. So Kakab became Kochav. So they're talking about the star of Anu, and the way of Anu means planets or objects up outside of the Earth's atmosphere. This says here, the deity Enlil, the god Enlil, went by the planets. How many planets did he go by? Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Earth. We are the 7th planet from the outside coming in. And guess what? They used to represent Earth as a dot, 7 dots, which was mistranslated for hundreds of years as the 7 sisters or Pleiades. Zechariah was the first one to realize that the 7 dots actually meant Earth. Also, here we show where they found Earth, the way of Enlil. Now, the way of Enlil is our sky, inside of the orbit. Here's the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth. They came from outside of our solar system, passed 7 objects, and landed on the 3rd object from the Sun, which was the 7th one from the outside. And Zechariah also thinks that this means that they came from a planet of mountains. Now again, you see here, rocket, rocket, pile up, mountain, mountain. This is like directions. It's like information. So literally there's a artifact in a museum that discusses somebody else coming into our solar system from another planet and landing here. And it's always going to be there. I encourage anybody to go to the British Museum and see it for yourself if you're going to get out to London. They have a lot of fantastic, amazing artifacts out there. I once talked to the security guard who was standing in the room like this. I said, "Do you even know what you're standing in front of?" He's like, "Nope." I said, "Well, you know, you're standing in front of some of the most amazing, evidence in this planet." "Oh, really?" He had no idea, no concept. That's just outstanding. I mean, the record is left behind for us to find. Luckily, most of the tablets still exist. Okay, this is from Egypt, actually. I love this slide because there's so much stuff going on in it. So it's from the royal tomb of Huy, H-U-Y, in Egypt. And here's what looks like we see going on. First of all, we see something above ground, and we see something below ground. Above ground, we have prayers, worshipers, praying and facing away from the holy object. These guys are facing left, these guys are facing right. Even the animals are facing away. It's so holy, don't even look at it. Okay? But they are still paying reverence to it. Below ground, we see a whole bunch of stuff that looks like mechanisms, technology, machines, and then we have 2 guys underneath, look like they're doing maintenance. They're carrying hoses, they're cleaning. It looks like here we have some kind of exhaust port, just like an underground Titan missile. The exhaust has to be funneled outwards. But notice up here, now if you remember what the Apollo spacecraft looked like, I actually seen an Apollo spacecraft in the California Science Center downtown. They have the Apollo craft that actually, the last mission that went up and back. Oh, I'm sorry, no, the one that met with the Russians, the Soyuz. That's the Apollo they have at the California Science Center. But this is like a heat shield, just like we used when we used the Apollo, and the shape is similar. Notice there's straps here. But also notice, this is not a perfect image. There's scarring, scrapes, indentations, as if this object was used. It's not perfect. It's not pristine. Even though they're depicting something that the gods they appear to them to use or be involved with, they're not depicting it as a pure thing. They are recording history as they saw it. And here it looks like could be condensers for heat to sort of absorb the heat so it doesn't either pollute the population or maybe it's not allowed to even go above ground from the exhaust. Egypt has some of the most incredible stuff left behind. Okay, now, I wonder sometimes, I look at something like that and I'm saying, okay, come on. Really? They were using rockets? I mean, this is the epitome of our rocket program right now, the space shuttle. Something that they say creates the loudest noise ever that humans have ever made on Earth. To get outside of our orbit, you need to go 6 miles a second to escape velocity. It's 27,000 miles an hour. It's fast. I mean, is it true that rockets existed thousands of years ago? I mean, is it possible? So besides the visual evidence, I want to look for textual evidence or recordings of stories that could possibly match. And that's the great thing about this kind of data. Now, this is from the story of Gilgamesh. So we see that Gilgamesh, here's what we got here. No God passed by. Why are my limbs paralyzed? Did I have a dream? The heavens cried out, earth roared. Daylight vanished and darkness issued forth. Lightning flashed, fire broke out. Clouds swelled, it rained death. The glow disappeared, the fire went out. All that had fallen turned to ashes. Does that describe this? Is any part of this experience not like what Gilgamesh recorded? The fire, the smoke, and whatever came down is ashes. It all matches. I can't find anything that's out of order from this. So it seems to me that when you see, first of all, the Dingir object, the Dingir pictograph of what gods meant, then you see an actual depiction on a tomb in Egypt of a rocket ship. Then you also see a little toy rocket ship. Then you see you read a description in the text. All the pieces of evidence come together, visual, textual, recordings by the ancients. Apparently somebody came to this planet and the evidence is very available for anybody to see for themselves. That's what they claimed. That's what the ancient people said. Our gods came here. They came from this planet. They told us they came. They gave us this knowledge and this knowledge. We didn't credit it for ourselves. And it's all there in museums and tablet form with the original still existing. So then I asked myself, okay, well, the rockets have to go somewhere, right? Okay, so here's a picture, and here's a text description, but okay, if they're landing, well, where are they landing? Where are they taking off from? Well, there's me. How small do I look compared to that giant stone? I think I look pretty tiny. This is on Malta. This is one of those temples that did not get washed over. What's funny about these ancient temples that you see all over the ancient world is they're always round. The center is empty, and all of the walls are huge. Now, why do people living in the year 3600 BC or earlier, why do they need to make a stone or use a stone this big? What the heck is the point? What's it for? If not to protect the civilization that exists around from two things. Possibly rocket exhaust, or the gods wanted a place where they could be alone without having people looking at them, a private sanctuary. But who here thinks that this is a big stone? Okay, we have one person there who thinks it's a big stone. Good. Okay. This is the biggest stone on Earth. Biggest cut stone. That's 25 people from a tour group that Zechariah led in front of a single stone from Baalbek, Lebanon, still sticking out of the quarry. Look at the perfection of the cut. Look how perfect it is. Tell me, do humans need to work with stones this big? The last stone from Malta was gigantic, more than anybody would need to work with. Why would humans need to work with stones this big? What's funny is the location where this stone is, this is what's left in the quarry. Guess what? 3 stones are in place up here, the same size. This is a guy standing on the ledge. This is level 2. This is level 3. Notice down here, smaller stones, level 2, medium stones. The giant ones, the trilliton, are up here. It's estimated to weigh 1,100 tons each. Today, modern technology, we cannot move the stone except for straight up and straight down. Now that was something that may protect you from rocket blast or rocket exhaust. You don't come to Earth with giant bricks. You come to Earth with tools and you use what you find here. And stone is carved from, you know what? Stone is carved from the heat of our planet, from the processes of catastrophes built up over millions of years. They can take heat, they can absorb heat, they can protect the civilization and people around it. And by the way, this area of Baalbek, Lebanon has always existed. There's never been a time in history where that did not exist. There's no story of it being built. The local story is, of course, the gods built it. And by the way, this is the biggest stone platform in the world. This is a top view of it. It's bigger than the area of the pyramids. It's just a huge, gigantic platform with huge, gigantic stones that no humans would ever even now be able to move. But for some reason, whoever worked with it before had no problem moving and using such stones. Simple, easy. They put 3 of them up there on the 3rd level like nothing. But they also left behind that one gigantic one that's in the quarry. Now this is a Phoenician coin that we call the Byblos coin. We think that this is depicting that Baalbek, Lebanon platform with its object on the platform. So here's the wall that surrounds it. Here's the temple that also surrounded it, like was near it. By the way, this area, the Romans built the biggest temple in their empire on that spot, the temple to Jupiter, which was on Baalbek, Lebanon. And it's amazing to find this evidence in all these different forms. Physical objects left behind, depictions, physical things on the ground, stories in the text. I mean, it's just every angle that you look at it, there's evidence there. This is why I love it, because there's actually something to study. There is something to go after. It's not type 3 data, it's type 1. But now we move into a different direction. Now we've seen some of the technology, we've seen some of the stories, we've seen a whole bunch of stuff that is in the wrong time frame, that should not exist if the story of our history has been told to us accurately. And now we move to the Bible itself. This is the current modern theory, the most modern theory of the Bible and who wrote it. As you can see, the identification of the authors of the 5 books of Moses. It's true, Moses is not considered anymore to be one of the authors of the original 5 books. Because there's nothing left behind from that time frame, from that era. We don't have any evidence left behind from that. Right now, the current thinking is the following. There's 4 authors listed here. There's another couple of authors that are included. The J author was from the kingdom of Judah, and he used the term Yahweh. The E author was from the northern part of Israel, the Israelite kingdom, and he used the term El or Elohim. There's a priestly author, and then there's the redactors. And what's funny is there's multiple stories where we can see the evidence of different authors in them. Here's more examples. And what happens is, you could tell by the style of writing in Hebrew, not in English, because in English, every God name is said Lord or God. It doesn't change. In Hebrew, Yahweh is not the same as El or Elohim. It's a different name in Hebrew. So what's happening is I only have 2 pages of here. This is from a book called Who Wrote the Bible by, what's his name? Richard Elliott Friedman, okay? So I want to read you something from a little paragraph from his book here. The combination of P with J, E and D was even more extraordinary than the combination of J and E with each other had been centuries earlier. P was a refutation. It was an answer Torah to J and E. J and E denigrated Aaron, the high priest Aaron. P denigrated Moses. J.E. assumed that any Levite could be a priest. P said that only men who were descendants of Aaron could be priests. J.E. said that there were angels, that animals occasionally could talk, and that God could be found standing on a rock or walking through the Garden of Eden. P would not have done that. D, meanwhile, came from a circle of people who were as hostile to P as the P circle were to J.E. These 2 priestly groups had struggled over centuries for priestly prerogatives, authority, income, and legitimacy. And somehow, someone put all these works together. Someone was combining J and E with the work that was written as an alternative to it, and this person was not merely combining them side by side as parallel stories. He or she was cutting and intersecting them intricately. And at the end, combined, interwoven collections of the laws and the stories of J, E, and P, this person set Deuteronomy and farewell speech of Moses as a conclusion. Someone was merging the four different, often opposing sources so artfully that it would take millennium to figure out. This author thinks that the redactor was Ezra, the last person in the Bible stories credited with compiling and canonizing the material and reading it to the people. We're going to see in a moment, when we get to the story of Noah, how easy it is to see different authors. But also you're going to see that besides these authors, there's going to be other infiltrations of stories that come into the Bible itself, the Old Testament. Now, here's the archaeological look at the time frames. Based on geographical strata, we have archaeological periods. The time of Solomon and David would have been Iron Age 1 here. Here's the only, now in the history of the Old Testament, God gets the Israelites out of Egypt. They come as a gigantic group out of the Sinai. One generation dies out, another generation is allowed to develop. They come into the land of Canaan with Joshua, and they conquer the whole land. The problem is that the archaeology does not match that. The physical evidence does not match the story. And the only time the combined kingdom existed in that history is during three kings if you count Saul for a short time. Saul, David, and Solomon. That's the only time period where the whole Israelite and Judea kingdom was combined into one group. What happens is, after Solomon his son takes over, the kingdom split up. The Israelite north is conquered by the Assyrians right over here, and that's the end of them. The Judean kingdom continues to the 586 BC until the Babylonians conquer them. Most of the thinking right now is that the Old Testament story of the judges leading to the story of the kings, leading to the actual canonization and redaction of putting together all of the laws and rules that we know about, happened during this time frame, Josiah, because he's the one who's considered the most righteous Judean king, almost like Moses, almost like Solomon, David. He has that kind of stature. All of the Israelite kings are considered to do evil in the eyes of God, and therefore they're demeaned over there. Many of the archaeological sites were misidentified. For example, they found Megiddo was built up by this line of kings, the Omri dynasty. Omri, Ahab, and Azariah. They're the ones who have the most negative wording about in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings. They were the most evil. And it looked like they misidentified Megiddo's built up to Solomon, but it did not occur in Iron Age 1. The time period that it occurred in was Iron Age 2, after more modern methods came out with carbon dating and other testing. So what's happening in Israel is a complete revolution in thinking. And it's a big problem for them, because they are not finding the historical precedents for the stories to match up to their claim that the land belongs to them from the God of the universe, or the biblical God promising it to them. And also, it seems that it wasn't the way that they were settling, the story of Joshua of conquering the whole land, city by city, in a very short time, also doesn't match up archaeologically. It seems more likely that there was a slow buildup, that the Israelites came from the same people that lived there, the Canaanites, and they separated themselves into small farming communities and small populated areas. In this time period, Iron Age 1, when we look for Solomon and David, who supposedly Jerusalem was their kingdom, Jerusalem could not have supported more than 5,000 people. They don't find the artifacts, the archaeology, the buildings left behind to support the amount of people that would have been needed to run a kingdom, a combined kingdom. So there's a whole turnaround right now in the archaeological dating and the history being, well, not rewritten, but more like acknowledged that a lot of it was embellished. A lot of it was inherited, and we're going to see some of that. In the Bible, even going up to the last books, the months of the years are considered the first month, the seventh month. Later on, the Hebrews adopt the Babylonian months, which is also Sumerian months, but the names change, and Assyrian. They adopt the whole calendar. So now the beginning where Passover is, for example, is Nisan. That used to be the head of the year. But Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's festival, comes in Tishrei. The Babylonians used to celebrate the spring or the fall equinox as their new year. So the Jews, in a way, there's a confusing influence, because in the Bible it's supposed to be the spring, but the secular Babylonians used this autumn equinox. And so here's another major influence where the Hebrews ended up borrowing the whole calendar from the culture that conquered them last. The last conquering culture was the Babylonians. And then when they came back under a Persian Empire, they were able to rebuild a second temple. And we're going to see more other influences that come in. Okay. Here's a Sumerian, Akkadian cylinder seal that shows the first human being being created. Here's the god Ninti. She meant goddess of life, and also T was later on mistranslated as rib in Hebrew. She's holding up a baby. Over here is the tree of life with 9 branches on it, like the 9 birth months. Over here is a guy on his knees mixing a pot of clay or some kind of mixture. There's a shelf of test tube vials, and there's Enki, who always was the chief scientist, holding literally a test tube. Now this is supposed to be ancient, but this is an extremely modern depiction of a laboratory scene. And we're going to see in a moment the text that goes along with this. But this is one of the stories that is the visual depiction of how humans were formed, how we were formed, why we were created. Another influence is this one, BLMJ Seal 377. BLMG stands for Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem. This shows the gods throwing up their hands. They're tired. They're disgusted. Now, notice it says here showing gods building a tower from 2200 BC. That also predates the Bible, but guess what? This tower is very small. So I talked to the curator of the museum. Her name is Joan Westonholtz. She's one of several members on the panel. And I said, why does this say building a tower? This matches the Sumerian story where the gods were fed up with working. They threw their hands in the air, and they decided to create workers to satisfy the need because of the revolt. And she says, I'm arguing with the panel of curators now to change the definition and meaning of this. The process to redefine this cylinder seal will take years. Even now, I don't know, it's 3 years later since I met her, if they have relabeled this and re-identified the story that's going on. So what we're seeing is the beginning of the visual evidence of the creation of man story. Here's Ninti holding up a baby from a laboratory with test tubes. Here's a depiction of the gods, all with horned hats, being fed up and saying, okay, we're done working. From Atrahasis. Atrahasis is one of the characters who was the hero of the flood. He was like Noah in the Bible. Let man bear the load of the gods. Create a mortal that he may bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Elil. Let him bear the load of the gods. We were created to do work for the gods. In their mythological story of the creation of man, which, by the way, is very similar to how the Bible says we were created to work in the garden. It's the same thing. Now look here. Nintu shall mix clay. Nintu and Ninti is the same. Nintu shall mix clay with his flesh and blood. Then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. Let us hear the drumbeat forever after. Let a ghost come into existence from the god's flesh. In this term here, ghost is like spirit or Holy Spirit. Nintu mix clay with flesh and blood. That's the biblical story. In the biblical story, God Elohim fashioned the Adam from clay of the soil, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam turned into a living soul. The Bible's creation story is borrowed from the Mesopotamian story, and the evidence is very clear. What we're going to find out is that the word blood and clay and flesh and man are from the same root word in Hebrew. And here it is. The word for man is Adam. That means human. The word for blood is dam. How Hebrew works is you have a root word, and then they add stuff to the front, to the back, and they take the sounds. So Adam is man. Dark and red is Adom, and in Akkadian, Adamatu. Dam means blood, and Adama is soil or earth. So from a Mesopotamian story that has 4 or 5 different words, Hebrew uses the one word meaning Adam, and then it plays on that and comes out with all the other meanings. And this other term of this breath of life is like, let a ghost come into existence from the God's flesh. It's the same way of saying he blew into his nostrils a breath of life. But in the Sumerian original, the word was Beit She'imti, and Beit She'imti meant house of breath, wind, life. And in Hebrew, that term is nishmat. So think of the sounds. Nishmat and She'imti is sha, ma, ta, the consonants. The vowels get changed over thousands of years of spoken language and accents. But the meaning is the same. And in Akkadian, the She'imti is also the word nafishtu, in Hebrew nefesh, meaning soul. So, Hebrew keeps one sound of the word, nishmat is from She'imti, and then it also has a word for the meaning, meaning soul, from nefesh, from Akkadian. And what you have is a way to find out the origin of the creation story. Now, it may seem a little complicated from here because Hebrew, to understand Hebrew, you may need a lot of practice, but the important point is that in their story, blood and clay is different words. Man and mixed together is all different words, but in Hebrew it all comes together in one meaning. From Adam as the root to Adam, red, Adamah, soil or earth, and Adam is blood. Okay, we mentioned the word Anunnaki before. This is another progression of language slide. Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came, and Enki was the chief of the Anunnaki. Just like Hebrew took the word Adam, man, and has 4 meanings from it, Hebrew takes this word Anunnaki and makes the word giants into that word. Now remember we saw the picture of Enki. He was seated and he was as tall as the other beings. If he stood up, he would have been gigantic. Anunnaki becomes the word Anak, singular, or Enki is the same as Anaki or Enki. See, again, the A and the E is insignificant, and Anakim is giants in plural. So the Hebrew takes the sound of Anunnaki and keeps that sound. Because Anunnaki is a word that's been spoken for thousands of years. And these words have been carried down, and these multiple authors had these influences, and they didn't move away from them. That was part of their own history. These were holy terms and holy words. Hebrew also takes the meaning of the word Anunnaki and moves that to mean Nephilim, from the Hebrew word nafal, fallen down. Now in Aramaic, the word for giant can be Nephila. So Nephilim is giants, which is why it was mistranslated for giants for many years. At the same time, it also means fallen ones from the word nafal. And so Hebrew has one meaning and one sound progression. The same thing with the word Adam, where it means blood, red, soil, and man. And then there's a modern word, Rephaim. In Hebrew, it means ghosts, but in the story of the Bibles, Rephaim are a type of giant. And there's different types of giants mentioned. Okay, here's I think it's our only Hebrew slide of the night. I'm going to read this for you, and you're going to see how some of the words are translated correctly, some of them are mistranslated. We're over here. This is chapter 6 of Genesis. Vayir'u b'nei ha'Elohim et banot ha'adam ki tavo hinei v'yikachu lahem nashim mikol asher bacharu. Vayir'u b'nei Elohim, the children of the gods saw. Et banot ha'adam, that the daughters of man, ki tavo, they were attractive. Hinei v'yikachu, and behold, they took them, lahem nashim, as wives, mikol asher bacharu, from all that they chose. Okay? And down here, this is the reason that the flood occurred. Because these children of gods were mixing with human daughters, human beings, females. Here it says, Hanephilim, these fallen ones, Hayu ba'eretz ba'yimim ahem, that were there in those days, v'gam achrei, and afterwards, Ken asher yava'u b'nei ha'Elohim, el banot ha'adam, v'yadu lahem ha'imei hagiburim asher me'olam, anshe Hashem. Those giants were there in those days, and also afterwards, when they came unto the children of the gods, saw the daughters of man were attractive. These were mighty men, hinei gibarim, asher me'olam, well, you're going to see in how they mistranslated in English, but they were from olam. Anshe Hashem means men of reputation or name. But look how the English version of the Bible that I chose to copy from directly mistranslates this, okay? This is from an Art Scroll series called the Stone Edition, and it's newly translated. Instead of saying sons or children of gods, they use sons of rulers. This is the only time in these two sentences where Elohim is not translated as God singular,
but rulers. All of a sudden, they intentionally mistranslate it. So it says here, it came to pass when man began to increase on the ground, daughters were born to them. The sons of the rulers saw that the daughters of man were good and took themselves from whoever, took wives from whoever they chose. Over here, well, they used to translate Nephilim as giants. Now the modern method, because of what Zechariah has done for so many years, they leave the word Nephilim in there. And even down here it says Nephilim were giants. Okay? That's from a different part of the Bible where Moses sends spies into Israel and they do come back seeing giants. But so the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards when the sons of the rulers, again, that should be B'nai Elohim, that should be children of the gods, but it's mistranslated intentionally, were concerned with the daughters of man who would bear to them. They were mighty men from old, were men of devastation. I don't know where and how they create Anshe Hashem to be men of devastation. Hashem could be the name. Hashem could be men of name, men of reputation, men of renown. Zechariah thinks that the word Shem could also be a reference to a rocket ship type object, which is that which is something that remembers you by. There's a story where King David, there was a battle and he left a Shem behind, a memorial. But how they could translate Shem to be men of devastation, and from Olam, they translate as from old. Because Olam could be the word forever in Hebrew. It makes no sense to me. The reason I bring this up is to show you that this is an intentional mistranslation by, the people that translated this Bible, so that they won't have to use the term children of gods. And I don't even know why the word men of devastation makes no sense. I mean, it doesn't translate from Hebrew at all. But again, this is the reason why the flood was given. And we will see other flood stuff later on near the end of the lecture from the book of Enoch. And here's the command before the flood to make the ark. This is from Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is one of the oldest literary tales that survives in complete form. 16 tablets, found in many different languages. Gilgamesh was on a journey to figure out why he had to die. His good friend Enkidu was already killed, and he said, why do I have to die like humans? Why am I not like the gods? Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine. He claimed to be a hybrid being. His mother was a goddess, his father was the priest king of Uruk, and he later became the king of Uruk. So he was also the first in history to become or claim to be a hybrid. He meets the hero of the flood, Utnapishtim, as the first version of the character that we know of as Noah. In the oldest language, his name is Utnapishtim. When we saw Atrahasis in the creation story, that's another name for the same character. The great gods stirred their hearts to make the flood. Here was an impending disaster that the gods knew was coming. They met in a council, and they were not supposed to warn the humans that it was coming. Enki, the god of Utnapishtim, tells them through behind a reed wall. In other words, he doesn't tell them directly, but he gives them the information. Build an ark, abandon riches, seek life. Scorn possessions, hold on to life. Load the seed of every living thing into your ark, and the boat that you will build. Cover it with roof as the abyss is covered. This is several thousand years before the Bible is written. But obviously, this is the origin of the story of Noah to build the flood. To build the ark to survive the flood. Now, we know that, most people think that, okay, how many animals or how many of each kind did Noah take onto the ark? 2 of every animal, right? Okay, so what happens after the flood in the Bible story? Noah builds an altar to God. The word here, Hashem, is God, because in the Hebrew translation they don't say Yahweh, they just say Hashem, meaning the name. And he took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And God smelt the pleasing aroma. Now, okay, if he had 2 of every animal, didn't he just kill off a species by creating an offering? And what's him and his family going to eat? So here's an example where we see a direct example of 2 different authors putting a story of Noah together. Now I'm reading here from a copy, but I don't have a slide of it. And from all that lives, this is God commending Noah, of all flesh, 2 of each shall you bring into the ark to keep alive with you. They shall be male and female. 2 of each shall come to you to keep alive. This is what we all know, we're all familiar with. But 3 sentences later, it says this, of every clean animal take unto you 7 pairs, a male with its mate. And of the animal that is not clean, 2, a male with its mates. Of the birds of the heavens also 7 pairs, male and female. This is in the Bible. This is just 3 sentences later. But until I read this myself, after looking at the evidence of different authors, I was even surprised to find out that, oh my God, yes, he's commanded to take 7 pairs of clean animals, which means kosher, animals that they could eat. So he was able to sacrifice because a different author wrote the story with 7 pairs and not 2 pairs. But the redactor kept both versions in. Why didn't he just remove the 2 part and leave the 7 part? Because it's not what the redactor did. The redactor simply put together all of the common history and what was written down and put it together, which is why you have 2 animals of each and then 7. 2 different authors contributing to the same story. And when you see the Mesopotamian version, you know that both of those authors borrowed from an earlier source and earlier tablets. And where did it come from? Very similar to where the months of the names, the Hebrew months, were picked up from Babylon. During the exile, it seems that a lot of the stories of the Bible were picked up, borrowed, and incorporated. Because it's only after they come back for the Babylonian exile and after they come back when the Persian Emperor Darius allows them to come back and rebuild, do they actually canonize the Bible, and Ezra puts it together and they read it to the people. So much foreign influence came in that we can actually trace where it came back from, and it was those mythological stories of those other cultures that came into it. Now here's another problem. Why is God enjoying the smell of the meat being cooked by Noah? The God of the Bible is supposed to be a non-physical creator God. He should have no physical characteristics. That's how they wrote him. And yet, he's enjoying the smell of that burnt offering. Good. It's completely out of place unless you, after thousands of years of finally digging up the correct stories, find where it came from. And lo and behold, down here, the gods smelt the fragrance, gathered like flies over the offerings. When they had eaten the offering, then they had a discussion. It was the Sumerian gods that liked the fragrance and the smell being cooked. They're the ones that came down. But later on, the redactors and those authors of the different biblical stories changed the names to Hashem, God, Yahweh, or El, or Elohim. They took the story and changed the names for purposes of creating a Bible that has one God interacting with the humans. But notice something up here. I'm going to read this to you. There's so much more detail in these Mesopotamian stories that were left out of the Bible. This is rich, rich information that we won't know. Look, what's happening is Ninti is being quoted here. Nintu is the same as Ninti, as crying over the fact that the humans are dying, her children. She and Enki created them, and now they're being killed. Shall I ever finish weeping for them? She wept. She gave vent to her feelings. Ninti wept and fueled her passions. The gods wept for their country. She sated with grief. She longed for beer. Wherever these gods were was not on the land or on the surface of the earth where the destruction and the flood was. But where they were able to see it, but they didn't have proper provisions because they were satiated, they were longing for beer, means they needed to drink. Thirsty were their lips. For 7 days and 7 nights the torrent, storm, and flood came on. Now we have a gap. And then they came down and they smelled the pleasing aroma, okay? And here, they came for the smoke offering, okay? Now that's from Atrahasis, who was one of the heroes of the flood. This is from Gilgamesh. Down here, again, same story. The gods smelt the fragrance. The gods smelt the pleasing fragrance. Now we know where the Bible authors borrowed it from. They borrowed it from the Sumerian version, the Akkadian version, the Mesopotamian version. This would have been the versions that they knew from being in Assyria or Babylon. Those empires, these were these stories. That was their stories. But also notice this. I put out and released a dove. The dove went, it came back. In their story, the dove goes out first. In the Bible story, the dove is the last bird that Noah sends out. And then the swallow I put out, and the swallow came back. And finally the raven went out, and the raven did not come back. And after the raven did not come back, in this story, Utnapishtim knew that the waters had receded and they could get out of the ark. In the biblical story, the dove is the final bird that doesn't come back. So yet they change the order of the birds, they change the name of the characters, but they keep specific. They must have just loved this line. I mean, it's a very strange line to leave in, but they loved it. And so those authors kept it in. And even though there's two different authors writing the story of Noah, one having a memory of 2 animals and one having a memory of 7, they still keep in, the redactor does, the wonderful line of God smelling the pleasing aroma. I mean, it's incredible that nowadays, after thousands of years of this material being accepted as original, we can actually see the origins of where it came from. That's what makes the Sumerian and Mesopotamian stuff so unique, because these tablets, this is all from tablets. This isn't just, scrolls. These tablets exist all over, and that's where the stories come from. And here's the Tower of Babel story in the Bible from Genesis 11. The whole earth was of one language and one common purpose. My God, what a wonderful time to live on this planet, huh? Well, God wasn't too happy with that. And it came to pass when they migrated from the east, they found the valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. Shinar is Sumer. Again, that's how the Bible uses the term. Instead of Sumer, Shinar. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them in fire. Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed across the whole earth." But now you should know that the word name here is Shem. Now, before I mentioned that before the flood story, the men of Olam, the men of Shem, which could have been, as Zechariah said, men of a rocket ship, would make more sense if the word Shem here did not mean name. Well, let's talk about this. Are they building a skyscraper? Are they building a tower that is so tall that it's going to reach the heavens? Because somebody on the next mountain nearby would be looking at them and laughing, going, I mean, come on, you're not building anything too tall. That's crazy. They're not building skyscrapers 4,000 BC. But if they were emulating a tower that was a launch tower, if they were trying to build what they saw their gods doing and acting, that would make a lot more sense in this term here. Again, we have here a situation where God is not happy that the people are working together with one common language. Now, he's already created man and given a flood and destroyed them. He already put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and took them out of the garden. He had a flood he destroyed all human life except for one family. And now here he is again changing languages and making the people not be able to communicate. Behold, there are one people, one language for all, and this is what they begin to do. And now should it not be withheld from all they propose to do. Come, let us descend and there confuse their language, that they should not understand another's language. So God decides to change civilization again in the story of the Bible. Well, again, what we're seeing is the reason that it doesn't really make sense is because it's not an original story. It comes from a Sumerian version again. This is from Samuel Noah Kramer. Man had no rival. Harmony tongue Sumer, the great land of the Mia of Princip. Harmony tongue means one language. To Enlil, in one tongue gave speech. Now in their story, Enlil gave us language. Not Yahweh, Enlil. And down here, the Lord of Eridu, endowed with wisdom, changed the speech in their mouths, put contention into it, into the speech of man that had until then been one. So thousands of years earlier, this story of mankind's language being changed was written from a different God's point of view. And the authors of the Bible redacted and changed the words again and changed the God who did it. But here again we can see the origin of the story. And then the question is, were they really building a skyscraper, or were they building something else to emulate what they saw that God's doing? Here's another problematic borrowing or literary borrowing. See, what we're seeing is our history as it's been told to us has not been told to us accurately. The type 3 method of writing it down without any evidence from a single witness or several different authors has resulted now, after it's been dug up for hundreds of years, the evidence of where the original stories came from. That's a problem. Especially here, because guess what? Moses is the greatest lawgiver of the Old Testament. His birth story is borrowed from Sargon the Great, king of Acadia, from 1,000 years before him. Moses is allegedly 1250 BC. Sargon is 2280 BC. 1,000 years earlier, Sargon the Great. My changing mother conceived me in secret. He was born in secret. She set me in a basket of rushes with bitumen and sealed the lid. He was put into a basket, Sargon was, and the lid was covered. She cast me to the river, which did not rise over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he clipped his ewer. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Sargon was appointed gardener and eventually favored by Ishtar and became king of his people. And Moses? Moses was conceived in secret and hidden for 3 months. He was put into a basket and covered with tar and pitch and left to float in the river and found by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised up to be eventually the king of the Israelites, or the leader of the Israelites. Now, the Old Testament has a really big problem when the birth story of Moses is borrowed. What my research has shown me is that for some reason birth stories are, some of them are very original, some of them are borrowed, some of them are, there's double birth stories. It's sort of like a, for some reason birth stories are a unique blend. I don't know why it's hard for them to find, these authors, hard for them to find original stories. Maybe they just love the story so much. Because you can't, I mean, is it possible that historically the same exact thing happened to Moses as happened to Sargon? I guess it's possible. Anything is possible. But when you see all these other stories borrowing, I lose the possibility and I just see literary borrowing. Borrowing from stories that already existed because they were great stories. And then who would know? Well, only later on, thousands of years later, when we dig it up, does anybody find out. Inanna Ishtar. She was the first bikini model in history. She was a goddess of love and war. Her name Inanna is a prototype for a Russian name that's Ina. Ishtar is also, well, this character Inanna Ishtar was famous for so many things. And we'll see the next slide what other things she did that was famous for. She also became the prototype of the Asherah doll, which was found in Israel. All excavations found the Asherah doll, which was basically a goddess holding her breasts, and either with wings or without wings. She was the temptress who tried to go, she tried to copulate with Gilgamesh, and he said no, and then she sent a bull of heaven after him to try to destroy him. But what else did she do that was very famous? She got upset because the character she wanted to have sex with, this guy from the city, did not respond. Inanna, because of her pregnant, and what did she do? All the wells of the land she filled with blood. All the groves and gardens of the land she sated with blood. The male slaves coming to gather firewood drink nothing but blood. The female slaves coming to fill up with water fill up with nothing but blood. In the historical record of turning rivers to blood, like we're going to see in the Bible, first plague of Egypt, Inanna did it first. In the biblical story, God tells Moses and Aaron, you're going to change it to blood. The river they changed to blood. The river became foul. Egypt could not drink from the river. The blood was filled throughout the land of Egypt. Even the necromancers of Egypt could not find the means to change it back. So, some scientists think, oh, the river changing to blood, the Nile River, that could have been a red bacteria type. I just see it as a borrowed story. Another borrowed story that was a miracle that Moses did, the first of them. And then there's a problem, because when your birth story is borrowed, and then there's a miracle of a plague that's borrowed, the question is, what is authentic? What is real history? Okay. This is a section from the Dead Sea Scrolls. What's amazing about this is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the era of 100 BC to 70 AD. And what we see here is now the Dead Sea Scrolls, 30% of them have Old Testament texts, the same exact copies as the versions that we have now. So we know that those versions have been the same for 2,000 years. But guess who's mentioned here? Gilgamesh in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it makes no sense. Gilgamesh is 2,500 years earlier. He should not exist anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is showing, now look at this, about the death of our souls, and all his colleagues entered, and Ohaya explained them what Gilgamesh had told them. Here's the word, but the giants rejoiced over him. Now we know the giants, it was saying Anunnaki, or Anakim, because this word here is Nephilim. So here we have Nephilim, Anakim, and Gilgamesh mentioned in the same paragraph. This should not exist. This is just another confirmation of this influence that came into the Old Testament, was from Mesopotamian sources, from Sumerian and Akkadian stories. This is this is a character 2,500 years earlier. That means that the borrowing and these stories were so influential, and this is only 500 years after the Babylonian exile ended and the Jews came back into Israel. It's astounding to see Gilgamesh. By the way, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first released, this fragment was not part of it. They left this out. This is only in the newer versions. Recently, there's been discussion whether the Essenes, the group that made up the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether or not they actually were a group called Essenes or something else. That's not part of our discussion, but it is a reasonable theory that the group was not what we've been told. Again, changing of the story down. This is the last influence from the Old Testament that we have in this lecture. The rest of it covers the New Testament. This is one of the oldest fragments of the New Testament that exists. This is featured in a book by Bart Ehrman called Jesus Interrupted. Bart Ehrman is the head of divinity of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He wrote at least 10 books. I've read 4 of them. And they make up part of this presentation on the New Testament. This little piece here is, here's what's happening. The first chapter of the book of Hebrews, in one of the oldest and best surviving manuscripts of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus, it's in the Vatican. Notice what's happening. There's a corrector who has erased a word and rewritten a word, substituted a word. Then a second corrector comes in, changes that word back to the original word, and he leaves this little mark. It says here, fool and knave, leave the old reading. Don't change it. I find that astounding. We actually have one corrector complaining that his Greek is being mistranslated. It's one of the, well, let's see from here. Yeah, here it is. Now, even though this is non-controversial facts, this information is extremely controversial. We don't have any of the original books of the New Testament, not one. The copies we have are much later, in most instances, many centuries later. We have thousands of these copies in Greek, the language in which all the New Testament books were originally written. But remember that Jesus spoke Aramaic along with all the disciples. They didn't speak Greek. All these copies contain mistakes, accidental slips on the part of the scribes who made them, or intentional alterations by scribes wanting to change the text to make it say what they wanted it to mean or thought that it did mean. We don't know how many mistakes there are in our surviving copies, but they appear to number in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now that's astounding for one of the world's most major religions. The vast majority of mistakes are insignificant, showing us nothing more than the scribe in antiquity could spell no better than most people today. But some of the mistakes matter a lot. Some of them affect the interpretation of a verse, a chapter, or an entire book. Others reveal the kind of concerns that were affecting scribes who were sometimes altering the text in light of debates and controversies going on in their own surroundings. When you look at the Old Testament, you could see the influences and where the stories originated from. In the New Testament, we don't have any originals. But the New Testament, like that Monsignor Balducci was worried about, the Vatican is concerned about, is all based on eyewitness testimony. And the stories sometimes don't match. There's 4 main Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Matthew and Luke are the only 2 Gospels that talk about the birth of Jesus. Mark and John don't discuss the birth. Jesus is already an adult who comes to John the Baptist when their stories begin. There's only one thing that Matthew and Luke agree upon on the birth of Jesus. Like I said, birth stories are very strange for some reason. All they agree on is Holy Spirit conception. Every other detail, Matthew and Luke disagree. Here's what's going on. If you read the book of Mark, the book of Matthew by itself, the book of Luke and John, you're reading what's called vertically. But when you read the stories horizontally, what you're doing is you're reading the birth story of Matthew, then you're reading the birth story of Luke. In Matthew's story, Herod is the ruler of Israel at the time of Jesus' birth. Herod is wise men see stars in the east, and they come over and they say to Herod, "Oh, the king of the Savior will be born in Bethlehem." In Matthew's story, Joseph, Mary already in Bethlehem. He doesn't have any reason to get them there. They're there already. What happens is these wise men don't return to Herod because they get a message that he deceived them and he really wasn't coming to honor Jesus. He was coming to kill him. So they leave. And what happens? Joseph has dreams that says to him, "Take Jesus, the Messiah, and leave. Go to Egypt." So in Matthew's story, after Jesus is born, they flee to Egypt. And they stay there for many years. Herod, meanwhile, slaughters all the children in Bethlehem that are less than 2 years old. But that's not the same story that Luke has. Luke has a story that's completely different. In fact, these can't both be right. In Luke's story, first angelic visitors visit Elizabeth, that's John the Baptist's mother, and Mary, and tell them of the impending birth. Then he talks about the birth of John. And then he also says this. Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, wanted to do a census and count all the people in the kingdom. And he also says Quirinius is governor of Syria at the time. He doesn't mention Herod, and Matthew doesn't mention Quirinius or Augustus. And there's no Roman record of a census being taken during that time either. So this is how Luke gets the family to Bethlehem, because the census is taken. Joseph, being of the line of David, had to go to the birthplace of the city of his generational ancestor 1,000 years earlier. And then Jesus is, of course, born in a manger in an inn, which is like a feeding trough. There's no wise men, there's no star, but some angels come to shepherds and tell them the Messiah is born, the king, and go visit him, and they do. And then what happens? In Luke's story, 8 days later, Jesus has a circumcision, just like a Jewish boy would do. And 30 days later, he's brought up to the temple. They offer a sacrifice for the newborn. And then they move to Nazareth, which is where Jesus of Nazareth came from. These stories exclude each other. Jesus could not have been born to Joseph and Mary and gone to Egypt and left, and at the same time stayed in Israel, had a circumcision, and presented to the temple. You can decide which story you want to believe. It's not up to me. These are the established Gospels. They both exclude each other. In this Luke story, there's no Herod, there's no slaughtering of children, there's no fear to Jesus, young Jesus' life. In Matthew's story, Jesus' life is in fear as a baby. In this story, he gets them to Bethlehem, because that's where the Messiah is supposed to be born from, by using the census story. Even Quirinius is not the governor at the proper time of Jesus' birth. Historically, it's an incorrect time period. So, which story is more accurate? Are they both made up? Is one made up more than the other? Is one oral history just from one version and one is from another? If Moses' birth story is borrowed, and you've got one of the plagues of Egypt being borrowed, and now you have the modern religion of Christianity, you have the birth story of Jesus being borrowed or made up, you have to question the stories. Not necessarily the lesson of the religion, but the stories that make it up. I find this astounding. They actually exclude each other's stories. One can't be right. If one is right, the other is wrong. If that one is right, then the prior one is wrong. And here's what's going on in the theory of the two theories of where Matthew and Luke came up with their material. One theory is they both borrowed from Mark. We're going to see next slide, how that's very accurate. And Q. Q is a German word, the symbol for quell, meaning source. So Q is a book that's called the Sayings Gospel, which they believe was made up of all of Jesus' sayings. And in the two-source theory, Matthew and Luke borrow from two different sources. Mark, and Q, the quell. In the four-source theory, Matthew and Luke first, they also borrow from Mark and Q, but then Luke had another source called L, and Matthew had another source called M. Now, I believe I found at least a hint of one of those other sources in the oral tradition in the book of Noah or in the book of Enoch, and you'll see that in a moment. So we know that, first of all, the stories exclude each other. So they borrowed it from somewhere. Now, this is called the synoptic puzzle slide. By the way, this slide and the last slide is from a book that's called, it's called The Main Gospel. What is it? The Complete Gospels, Annotated Scholars Version, edited by Robert J. Miller. The similarities between and among the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are striking. The three are called synoptic, in fact, because they present a common view of Jesus. Most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke employed Mark as the basis of their Gospels, to which they add other materials. There are powerful arguments to support this conclusion. Agreement between Matthew and Luke begins where Mark begins and ends where Mark ends. In other words, Luke and Matthew don't agree a lot. But when they do agree, Matthew reproduces about 90% of Mark, Luke about 50%. They often reproduce Mark in the same order. When they disagree, either Matthew or Luke supports the sequence in Mark. In segments the three have in common, verbal agreements average about 50%. The extent of the agreement may be observed in a sample of the triple tradition reproduced below. The lines are matched for easy comparison. So here's Mark and the sayings. Matthew is retelling what Mark said, and here is all Mark, and Matthew and Luke are reproducing exactly what Mark said word for word. They're copying it from it. The conclusion leads to further observations. Mark is responsible for the chronological outline of the life of Jesus represented by the synoptics. Matthew and Luke do not have independent evidence for the order of events. Mark is the earliest of the three. So here's the sort of accepted order now of how the books of the New Testament come together. First of all, John the Baptist is from 1 or 0 to the 27th Common Era. Jesus is to 30. John was killed a few years earlier. The first form of writing in the New Testament is from Paul. That's 50 to 60 CE. That's 20 years after the death of Jesus. That's the first writings. And then you have this source. It's also 20 years later, called the Sayings Gospel. In other words, finally, after 20 years, somebody got down to writing what Jesus talked about. That's pretty far out already based on the type 3 personal witness data type of scenario. Gospel of Thomas is from the Nag Hammadi library from the Gnostic tradition. It's 50 Common Era. Now we have Signs Gospel, which John picks up. These are the things that Jesus did, the miracles. Okay, Gospel of Mark is the first one that Matthew and Luke, we know, borrowed from 50 to 90% of it. That's 70 to CE. That's 40 years after the death of Jesus comes the Gospel of Mark. In Greek, not in Aramaic. Matthew is 80 CE, Luke is 90 CE. This is now 50 to 60 years after the death of Jesus, and they do not agree at all. In fact, they exclude each other's stories in many cases. They actually differ in the stories, not just disagreeing, but they exclude each other's stories and details from being true. All the way up to here. Now, here's Gospel of John, 90, the Common Era, 60 years after the death of Jesus. And John completely changes a lot of the stuff to first person. Instead of Jesus being humble, he talks about himself as being this, the beginning and the end, and the Savior and all this. But that's not what Mark, Matthew, and Luke talked about. The final version of the Bible, let me jump to here, of the New Testament, is after the Council of Nicaea. What happens is Constantine converts to Christianity. The whole Empire of Rome converts to Christianity, which was a very smart move at the time. And because the numbers of the Roman Empire were so huge, that doctrine won out. And every other story that was not part of doctrine became heresy. And heresy was not dealt with very well back then. The Council of Nicaea decided by voting what was the doctrine. Was Jesus divine? Was he human? Did he spill blood? Was he human and divine? All of the stories we know about that survived, those theologies came about by a vote. And what was going on was that many, many groups were arguing for their own version. And they all lost out. The Ebionites were Jews that insisted that following Jesus meant that you should follow the religion that Jesus himself followed. You should follow Judaism because Jesus was Jewish. He wasn't getting rid of his religion. He was an apocalyptic preacher who was preaching the end was coming if you don't repent. Follow the rules of Judaism. Follow those laws of my Father, and then be saved. Paul comes around. Paul is the founder of Gentile Christianity. Paul changes the religion, not to the religion of the one that Jesus followed. Paul creates the religion of Jesus the man. All you have to do is believe in him, the birth and the resurrection, the death and the resurrection. That's the religion right there. He completely says you don't have to follow any of the Jewish rules. A group called the Marcionites believed that Paul was the top apostle, you know, the best one of all. So the Ebionites were Jews who thought that if you follow Jesus, you should be Jewish. The Marcionites were Gentiles who also believed that there was two gods. The Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God. And there was other groups. There was an assortment of groups that argued for their own ideology, their own philosophy, and they all lost to Roman Catholicism because the sheer numbers of Roman Catholics when the empire converted won out. Their ideology won out, and the rest of it became heresy. Here's one of the sources that I think could be what Matthew and Luke uses from the oral tradition. It's from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we also have a version from the book of Enoch, which is the story of Noah, the birth story of Noah. Here's what's happening. Behold, I thought that within my heart, Mike, the conception was due to the Watchers and the Holy Ones. Now, Watchers in Hebrew is the Iri. The prior name in Sumerian was the Igigi. And to the giants, those are the Anakim. And my heart was troubled within me because of this child. So, Lamech is the father. His wife's name is Bath Enosh. And he says, this is not my child. Who's born here? Who's the father of this child? The father's parentage is being questioned. Similar to the story of Jesus. Who was the father? Well, the Holy Conception, right? The Spirit of God was the Father, right? But if God is not a physical being, then it has to be kind of an angel or that type of thing, and that's what happens in those two birth stories. So and she says to him, I swear that the seed is yours, and this conception is from you. The fruit was planted by you. So his wife is saying, no, 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 it is you. So this question of birth and who the father was is an older story than the New Testament itself. This story of the book of Enoch, it's in the book of Enoch and the book of Noah, goes back to 200 BC minimum. That's already 300 years before most of the New Testament. And here's the fragment from the Ethiopic version, okay? The last version was from Dead Sea Scrolls. This is found in the book of Enoch, translated from the Ethiopic text by R.H. Charles. And after some days, my son Methuselah took a wife for his son Lamech, and she became pregnant by him and bore a son. And here's a description of Noah, this incredible birth, and he doubted that it was his son. And his body was white as snow, and red as the blooming of a rose. And the hair of his head and his long locks were white as wool. He has a white and a red body, and he has white wool. And his eyes are beautiful. And when he opened his eyes, they lifted up the whole house like the sun. The whole house was very bright. It's a very strange birth. And thereupon, he rose in the hands of the midwife, opened his mouth, and conversed with the Lord of righteousness. Right away, Noah's born, and he's already talking to God and speaking. And his father Lamech was afraid and fled and came to his own father Methuselah, and he said, I have begotten a strange son, diverse from unlike man and resembling the sons of gods of heaven. Does it sound familiar? And his nature is different. He is not like us. His rays are like the rays of the sun, and his countenance is glorious. He seems to me that he's not sprung from me, but from the angels, and I fear that his days of wonder may be wrought on earth. So there's a description here that matches some of the things that were said about Jesus later, about this incredible birth. that was recognized by, in one story, by wise men, and in another story by shepherds. And as soon as he was born, people recognized something about him, that he was a Messiah. In the story of Luke, when he's brought to the temple, there's Simon and an old woman who recognize him as the Messiah. When he's taken to Egypt, in the story of Matthew, it's different information happening. Both of them seem to sort of lend a little bit piece of this. Now, here's what eventually Methuselah tells Lamech, his own son. There shall come a great destruction over the whole earth, and there shall be a deluge, a great destruction for 1 year. And this son who has been born unto you shall be left on the earth, and his 3 children shall be saved with him, when all mankind that are on the earth shall die. So Lamech is being told his son is going to be the savior of the people of the earth. Very similar to what's written about Jesus' birth story. Here's the Messiah being born. Right before his birth and during his birth, his mother's being told and Joseph's being told, this is the savior of your civilization. He hasn't done anything yet. All he's done is be born. And he's already they're being notified. It's like a foretelling of a prophecy. In this case, it's the Noah story. So his name should be Noah, and his son shall be shaven from destruction. Here's another part of the New Testament regarding the death of Jesus that's borrowed. These are tablets from the death and resurrection story of, guess what? Inanna Ishtar. This is what the actual tablets look like. So you see, what's left behind will exist forever. What happens in Inanna's story? After 3 days and nights has passed, she's brought back to life on the 4th day. What happens is she goes down to the netherworld, Africa or some other thing, and she's eventually killed. And after 3 days, some of the servants are coming up and begging and pleading the Father, God, and Lil, please save us. Let her not be put to death. But she's already dead for 3 days. But she's brought back to life on the 4th day. In the Jesus story, he's brought back to life on the 3rd day. Again, the birth story has hints of being borrowed. Well, first of all, the birth story is 2 different stories, but there's hints of the story of Noah's birth in there. Who's the father, the sons of heaven, the watchers, we're not sure. He'll be a savior to your civilization. And then the death story of being dead and resurrected is also borrowed. And here's, again, on the right side is the book of Enoch, and the left side is New Testament lines. In this slide, the lines are from the epistles of Paul, so from the writings of Paul. So from Galatians, this present evil world, and this author says the world of unrighteousness is matching it. This is from the R.H. Charles Ethiopic text of the book of Enoch. All of these lines are in the book of Enoch on the right, and their copies on the left. Here's from Ephesians. Above all principality and power, angels of power and angels of principalities, according to his good pleasure, according to his good pleasure. Children of light, the generation of light. Colossians, principalities and powers, again, angels of powers and angel principalities. In whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, the Son of Man who reveals all the treasures of that which is hidden. The writings of Paul are borrowing from an apocalyptic Jewish text called the Book of Enoch. So in this case, we do have an original form of where some of the writings came from. And again, the Book of Enoch is supposedly, the oldest version is 200 BC, with the most recent New Testament documents at least 50 AD for the writings of Paul, and 60, 70, and 80, 90 AD for the apostle books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And here's some from Timothy. Again, copies. And here's from Luke, Peter, and Matthew, borrowing from the book of Enoch again. He hath committed all judgment unto sin. The sum of judgment was given unto the Son of Man. Sons of light, generation of light. Many mansions, dwelling places of the holy, and the resting place of the righteous. Down here is the term for hell, Gehenna, in Hebrew. In Matthew, where Gehenna is the place of final punishment. In the book of Enoch, where Gehenna first definitely appears as hell. So now you see apostles borrowing the book of Enoch. And this is all the book of Revelations. Borrowing, and the book of Revelations is an apocalyptic book of the end of the earth, or the end of the world, which is what the Enoch also talks about, what will happen at the end in certain cases, in apocalyptic Jewish text. And that's also borrowed. The New Jerusalem, a new house. I am rich and increase with goods. We have become rich with riches and have possessions. I will come into him and sup with him. And with the Son of Man, the righteous shall eat and lie down and rise up forever and ever. By the way, this book is from 1912. The version that I have. This is not new information. I mean, this is almost 100 years ago this was published. And it's showing direct copies of New Testament copying older books. In the case of the death and resurrection, copying the story of Anan and Ishtar, that's a Mesopotamian version. That's very consistent with the Old Testament, borrowing from that. And also borrowing more recent texts. This is the last quote or slide from the New Testament. This is from the Gospel of Thomas. This Gospel was found in the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, which was found in 1945 under the ground. There's a long story of how finally the books came to be in the hands of scholars. But the Gospel of Thomas is dated before Mark, Matthew, and Luke now, at 60 or 50 CE. All of it, the whole book of Thomas is sayings of Jesus. Jesus said this, and here's the one I chose to end with. Jesus said, "Perhaps people think that I have come to cast peace upon the world. They do not know that I have come to cast conflicts upon the earth, fire, sword, war. For there will be 5 in a house, there will be 3 against 2 and 2 against 3, father against son and son against father, and they will stand alone." All religions are made up of type 3 data. Recorded history by one person or more, with many influences and many agendas and many reasons for trying to separate humans and communities from other humans and from other communities. The lessons of religion are wonderful. Treat thy neighbor as thy brother. Honor your father and mother. Be good to the land. Be good to animals. Care for each other. Care for the poor. Care for the downtrodden. But when a person's faith is mixed up with the mythology, with the stories, and your faith comes from the stories, then there's a lot of problems with that faith. Because one definition of faith is trust without data. And when you look at the data, you see a lot of these stories aren't true. But the reason that the Bible is so unique on our planet or in our Western culture is the Bible blends stories of gods with daily rituals for how to treat yourself and rules of how brothers and humans should treat each other. It's not like the Greek mythologies of just these God stories that don't relate to your daily life. When they canonized the Bible, when the final redactors and authors combined the Bible together with all the mythological stories, they included the rules of how you deal with slaves, how you deal with the land, how you treat each other. Is a king or a president equal to the law or above the law or subjected to the law? Don't the rights of everybody count? All of these parts are part of the Bible and Western tradition. That's why it took such a hold in society. But now, as we're coming into the age of Aquarius, and we're digging up and seeing archaeology and tablets, we're finding out that the stories themselves are not genuine, are not original. That doesn't mean the lessons are not good. But when a group practices exclusionary policies to another group, that's where the problem lies. When any religion or any group excludes themselves from other humans, it can't be forward moving. It's not a good thing. The only thing that could be good is bringing people together, respecting each other, respecting our earth, our planet, respecting ourselves and everybody else as fellow humans living on one planet, sharing one planet, and hoping surviving for thousands of years together. So we have to honor ourselves and our parents and the planets and people that can't take care of themselves. All of those things have to be followed, and those are the lessons of religions.